Hello, here we are once again at the Church in the World, Theology 345. I'm Dr. Gregory Jones, and this is session 3 that we will be talking about the wink text, the powers that be. What we're going to do today is we're going to go through some of the vocabulary. Before I do that, I want to share another 2 terms with you so that you might continue to build on your vocabulary list. I also will provide a vocabulary list for you on the Blackboard learning module so that you can begin to take these terms in and begin to use them as we move along in our study together. I want to talk to you today just very briefly, first off, about this text called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is spelled P-A-U-L-O F-R-E-I-R-E. I want to share just two terms out of this work that's very important for us as we look at this domination system and we look at some of the things that Wink is talking about. He talks about, in this text, fear of freedom. And fear of freedom and false generosity are the 2 terms that he used. Fear of freedom, he says, which afflicts the oppressed, a fear which may equally well lead them to desire the role of the oppressor or bind them to the role of the oppressed, should be examined. What he's talking about there is he uses the notion of fear of freedom to talk about prescription. In fact, he's saying that as people get caught up in these systems, they want to be part of and have power inside these systems. And so as opposed to fighting for their freedom away from these systems that we'll be talking about, they want to develop a position inside those positions. And he says this is a problem with humanity. So fear of freedom, keep that in mind, and we'll be dialoguing more about that a little later. The other thing that I would like to talk to you about, the other term, would be false generosity. False generosity basically works like this. A company or corporation has power, and it, in a generous way, gives some of that power to some of the oppressed. And that power, basically, that individual gets is based on a false generosity of the corporation. Let me give you an example. Eli Lilly charges maybe $15 a pill for a certain of its pharmaceuticals. Yet, at the same time, what Eli will do is Eli will basically give scholarships away to young people to go to schools. Well, of course, the young people who get the scholarships are not going to go contrary to that corporation if that corporation is funding their education. Yet that corporation is not doing that in an altruistic way. That company is doing it mainly to cement and concretize its power. So what Paulo Freire calls that is false generosity, as opposed to true generosity, which would be to reduce the cost of the pills and be equitable in terms of the distribution of pharmaceuticals. So those 2 terms I want you to keep in mind as we go along on this track, learning and trying to understand what Walter Wink is talking about when he talks about domination systems and powers and things of that nature. Paulo Freire gives us 2 terms that will be useful to us. Fear of freedom, that is the oppressed fear of fighting against those systems that are dominating them, and then false generosity. That's corporations or institutions basically concretizing its power by doling out some minor resources to the oppressed so that the oppressed will see them in a good light. But really that's false because they want to continue to oppress. We'll talk about those a little bit later. On to Wink now. Let's go look at Wink, and you should be reading in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th chapters now. We're going to look at the domination system and Jesus' response to it. I'm very briefly going to go through what the domination system is, and then I will not try to explain the terms this time. I just want you to acknowledge what those terms are in terms of Jesus' response to them, because he does have a response to the domination system. What the domination system is, basically, is how the corporations link together in order to create a system of oppression for people. The example I can give you today would be, let's say a student is going into an educational institution and needs financial aid. Okay, he or she works every day and has children, and they're trying to go to school. And what happens is that this individual who is paying for their education and trying to have financial aid loses their financial aid and cannot any longer participate in the education of themselves. They also lose their job. As they lose their job and lose their financial aid, they also lose their apartment. After they lose their apartment, they lose their health insurances. They try to get into predatory lending. They go to check for cash, trying to figure out ways to financially sustain themselves, and can't. That individual eventually loses their home and becomes homeless. And then eventually that individual becomes a burden or becomes a recipient of the state resources, but still it doesn't sustain them. They continue to spiral in this dominating situation where they lose more and more of their humanity. This is how the domination system works. When institutions begin to link together to excise people of their freedom and their financial sustainability, whether it's living wage, whether it's the inability for people to get overtime, whether it's the inability to people to find affordable housing or affordable child care. Child care is a horrendous way in which people are exploited, especially poor working mothers. Child care can be for a child anywhere from a couple of $100 to up to $500 each week. An individual could be paying for child care, trying to get adequate child care for themselves. And institutions are not amenable to creating daycare centers or centers where young people can leave their children and go to school. We see a system in play that is continuing to oppress people. And so that would be an example of domination system when corporations and organizations link together to create an exploitative process for people, or a dehumanizing process for individuals, whether it's adequate pay scale for women or equitable pay scale for women, whether it's the exclusion of minorities in terms of redlining or gerrymandering. However we see those kinds of systems in play where economic institutions, educational institutions, governmental policy, and individual organizations work to and continue to exploit, we see a domination system. A classic example would be the kinds of things we see happening to Native American communities in the treatment of them in trying to break treaty and take land. I mean, that's just an excellent way to see it happening in real time. If you go to fnx.org, you can go to First Nations experience, and you would see a plethora of experiences that the Shoshone and the Lakota and other groups are raising issue because the government connects with local mining and local farmers to excise the land from the treaty rights that they have as nations in this country. And we do that primarily to those who can least afford to defend themselves. So it's the poor, it's the elderly, it's persons of color, it's our immigrants. We see the domination system playing a significant part in and on. Okay, so let's look at some of the other terms that Wink is using in chapter 2 and chapter 3. One of the things that we see is Jesus' answer to domination. I'm just going to go through these with you. He talks about domination. He talks about equity. He talks about nonviolence, women. Jesus responds to the domination and with these, as well as purity and holiness, family, and law, sacrifice. These are ways in which Jesus begins to organize himself to respond to the imperial and empire kinds of building things we see happening with the Roman Empire during his day. And so I want you to learn those domination responses that Jesus has, and I will actually put them on a test, and you will have to list them out. Let's talk now about the myth of redemptive violence. When we talk about the myth of the redemptive violence, it's the notion that violence can solve problems. Most people feel that it can, that you need violence in some respects in order to retain and sustain civilization. I think that I agree with Wink. I don't think that you can say that you can be violent and still be civilized. I think, you might be working on being civilized, but you're going to have to excise violence out of your behaviors in order to claim civilization and sentience, which is self-awareness. The myth of redemptive violence is very fascinating, though. What we see in the myth of redemptive violence basically is the notion that there can be order out of chaos. And we see a lot of creation stories with this. Marduk, Gilgamesh, Beowulf, all are stories that explain how a creator must destroy either a relative or a creation, part of creation, in order to create peace and in order to create order. And so that notion of order out of chaos. And so when we see that happening in the military, what we say is that we have to have preemptive strikes, or there's certain violence that we have to do in order to bring peace to the Middle East. We see that notion of order out of chaos playing itself out in our everyday actions, one with another. This violence is continuing to escalate. And so I think Wink is onto something here when he says that the church must reform this demonic notion that we can have this myth of redemptive violence, that violence can be redemptive. Along with his reading, I want you to pay special attention to the scapegoat theory. And he says that particularly in terms of biblical, and he's being theological now when he says the scapegoat theory is something that was used early on in the Old Testament. And finally, we see it being used in the New Testament with Jesus Christ. But what we find out through various studies that Wink has done with a philosopher by the name of Rene Girard, that this notion of organized violence, the need for organized violence, was brought to an end through the entry of Jesus Christ into human history. Jesus Christ then becomes the last scapegoat. He becomes the last human sacrifice that we need for violence. And so after Jesus Christ is crucified, we have an opportunity. We don't take it as a church, but we have an opportunity to remove violence out of the church and out of religious community and out of Christian tradition. And we don't do it. We do just the opposite. We begin to organize ourselves around violence, and we begin to take advantage of that. Two terms that I want you to pay special attention to: in statu and in satu. In statu is the root word for institution. It's Latin. Okay, I'll give these to you in the term, and I can spell that for you. When we talk about in statu, it's INTITU, INSTITU. I'm sorry. INSTITU, in statu, the root word for institution. In satu is INSITU. In satu means original intent. The original intent for Christians were to be basically martyrs. In statu moves us from martyrdom to organized religion. And to organize religion, we have to accept violence in the church. And we see that happening. We'll talk a lot more about that as we move along through our text in this course. But remember those two terms. What else is happening in terms of this notion of scapegoat theory is that we see a participation in the celebration of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ as a way to rebalance society, which is totally, Wink suggests, opposite of what we're supposed to be about the business of doing. Religion kills Jesus, Wink suggests, and Jesus was the last scapegoat. is the ending of violence and human sacrifice that we don't recognize and we continue to disregard as we move into developing and institutionalizing Christianity. I want to give you one last term. It's called anti-steni, A-N-T-I-S-T-E-N-A-I. It means to stand against. This term has to do with standing against violence without being violent. And Jesus uses this term. When we're talking about standing against, we're not standing against by using violence. We, as Wink suggests, ought to be standing against without the use of violence. Because as we have just talked about, Jesus is the last human sacrifice, the last blood sacrifice for the Christian tradition. And we ought to follow that. Okay, I'm going to stop there today. I want to take a moment to just tell you that we will be looking at a couple of more terms, and we will be moving through this text pretty rapidly. On next time, we'll look at just war theory, and we will also talk about a couple of other theories of bringing peace and reformation to the Christian church. See you next time.